Welcome back, Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the 2023 Belgian Grand Prix. So starting right away with a driver who moves down one spot from last race is Logan Sargent. So for Sargent, not a great weekend, was beaten in all four competitive sessions by his teammate Alex Albon. And also had that little spin there in spring qualifying as well for good measure. So again, another not great weekend. And for me, I'm really starting to have a couple questions about how long will it take for him to kind of get close to Albon and start matching or even beating Albon occasionally, because that's something that needs to happen for the team to have confidence in Sargent's talent and his ability if they want to bring him back next year. So number 19, moving up one spot from last race, is Zhou Guangyu. So for Zhou, another tough weekend, similar to Sargent, beaten in all four sessions. That being said, I think had a little bit of a slightly better weekend than Sargent. And not a whole lot to say, of course, with these drivers in the lower midfield, because we don't really get to see them on track. But that being said, with Zhou, he did make some good moves. And did make his way up the field after a really poor qualifying in the race. Number 18, staying in the same position as last race, is Kevin Magnussen. So for Magnussen, tricky weekend. Did out-qualify his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, but that's more because Haas couldn't send Nico Hülkenberg out in time for qualifying. In both sprint qualifying and qualifying, missed the checkered flag both times. So we don't really have any real comparison for Magnussen in qualifying. The race was so-so though, not terrible, not great either though. Number 17, staying in the same position, is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, qualified 10th in the main race and then technically qualified 14th with his crash in the sprint qualifying. Sprint race wasn't so good, race was not great either. Did finish 9th, I thought it should have at least finished 8th. Was a bit unfortunate to get overtaken by Ocon towards the end there. And of course his teammate finished in 5th. So not a great weekend from Stroll, but that being said, the car has not been very good the last couple of weeks. So getting lower points finishes is about as much as we can really realistically expect from Stroll at this point where the car is. Number 16, dropping 2 spots, and that is Daniel Ricciardo. So for Ricciardo, probably not as good of a session of a weekend as Hungary was. Obviously qualified 19th for the main race with that track limits deletion, which he could have been up into Q2, maybe even Q3. The sprint qualifying though went much better, qualified 11th, and didn't look like he might have had a chance of getting points in that sprint race. The main race didn't go so well, was overtaken and finished towards the back while his teammate Tsunoda got points. So a bit of a trickier weekend, and of course only having one practice session in only a second race with this team will do that too. But that being said, not a terrible weekend for Daniel Ricciardo. Number 15, an absolutely awful weekend for this driver, Nico Hülkenberg. So for Hülkenberg, that's an awful L there, but whatever. Nico Hülkenberg, like I mentioned before, couldn't qualify, which for him, that's basically been his biggest strength so far this year. So the fact that he couldn't even do that, and plus the Haas having incredibly poor race pace and tire management meant that this weekend was always going to be a disaster without those qualifying results. He did finish last of the race finishers as well, so the race seemed to be quite tricky for him. But that being said, he's been quite good recently. So he stays 15th, but that being said, still drops quite a few positions. Number 14, moving up 2 positions, is Yuki Tsunoda. So the only driver in the bottom 4 teams to get points this past weekend, finishing in 10th, 10th place in the finish of the season, much like Stroll last year, only finishing in 10th, it seems. Much better race. The race and the qualifying for the race was very good. Sprint qualifying, sprint race, not so good. But that being said, I still thought that it was worth moving Tsunoda up. Number 13, moving down 2 positions, but they still had a pretty good weekend, and this is more because of drivers around them moving up. was Valtteri Bottas. Beat his teammate Joe in all 4 sessions and was one of the higher drivers of the Williams, Alpha Tauri, and Haas in all of the sessions, or in all of the races. I think the qualifying, the Alfa Romeo was definitely a really slow car, a really tricky car to get the most out of in qualifying, but in the race it can be pretty handy relative to the cars around it, of course. But that being said, a pretty decent weekend for Bottas as a whole. Number 12, and moving up 3 positions, is Pierre Gasly. So for Gasly, this is almost entirely based on his performance in the sprint race. Sprint qualified quite well, and then was really opportunistic with the strategy. Of course, all the drivers either pitted lap 1 or basically before the race even started. And Gasly was one of those who benefited from that. Came out 3rd, did a really good job of defending his position from Perez and then later Hamilton. But of course, he defended that position and got that those 6 really valuable points from that sprint race. The race was a bit more tricky. They decided to go for a really strange one-stop strategy, starting on the softs and then going to the mediums. Didn't really work out. If they'd gone to the more conventional 2-stop, they might have finished in the points where Ocon did. But nonetheless, a pretty decent weekend, I thought, for Gasly. Number 11, a bit of a better weekend for Sergio Perez. Qualifying is still not great, being out-qualified by about 9/10 by Max Verstappen. Of course, it's a longer lap, so it's not quite as representative as it would be on some tracks. But then again, if it was a really short track, say Austria, and you just cut the time in half, it's still about 4.5 tenths, which is pretty poor. The sprint race, of course, less said about that, probably the better for Perez. Of course, got knocked out by Hamilton, and then had massive damage, and then retired the car. I think it's one of those things where it's very close to a racing incident. But that being said, Hamilton did get the penalty, and I did kind of agree with that. In the race, did lead briefly after turn 1, but of course was much slower than his teammate Max Verstappen, but still kind of much better, much closer to what Perez needs to be doing if he wants to not have questions about his seat asked for next year. Of course, he does have a contract for next year. But that being said, with the level he was performing in June and July, there were a lot of questions that were being asked about his performance. So into the top 10 we go, and at number 10, dropping down 1 position, is Carlos Sainz. So for Sainz, a pretty decent sprint race, finished 4th, I believe. Yeah, 4th in the sprint race after Hamilton's penalty, and had a really good sprint race. The race, of course, he locked up into turn 1, made contact with Piastri, then basically was forced to retire because his car had a massive hole in it. So I think for Sainz, he makes that move, he locks up, and then kind of has to take avoiding action to avoid Piastri into turn 1. And I think it was a racing incident according to the stewards, and I kind of agree with it. But that being said, I do think I give a bit more blame to Sainz. He was the one who made that initial mistake, that initial lockup. And I think because of that, he could have backed out. Just like you couldn't argue that Piastri should have backed out too. But, it's one of those tricky things. I think Sainz will be bearing the fact that he lost a lot of points today. Let's see, going to number 9, moving up 1 position. A very good race for this driver is Esteban Ocon, finishing in 8th place. For Alpine, I think he'll be very happy with that result. Made a lot of good overtakes too, including a really nice overtake on Tsunoda at Le Combe. Also overtook Stroll, and I do think that the Aston is a bit better than the Alpine at this point, so definitely really good on Ocon for that. Sprint race was a bit trickier, of course, was behind his teammate. That being said, the main Grand Prix was very good. Let's see, number 8, moving down 1 position, is George Russell. So for Russell, really quite a tricky weekend, I thought. Got knocked out in Q1 in sprint qualifying. Main qualifying was a little better, but that being said, still quite a tricky result for him. And the main Grand Prix was quite far off his teammate Lewis Hamilton as well. So it was quite a tricky weekend for Russell, and he's had quite a few of those weekends recently, I think, as Hamilton's really gotten the better of him the last couple of months or so. Number 7, moving down 2 positions, but that being said, not a bad weekend for this driver, I thought, and that is Alex Albon. So for Albon, I think Spa would have been one of the tracks they were potentially targeting to get points. A lot of straights. It's generally one that where straight line speed is a lot more important. And I think Albon was just outside the points in the sprint. Main race was a bit trickier. I think they were really struggling with tire management though. And I think that's why I give Albon a bit of a pass for not getting points this past weekend or being really close to the points in the main race, is because with the one race, with the one practice session, it can be very tricky to get the setup right. And in addition, with the wet qualifying and all the wet weather, there were quite a few variations in setup. Like teams like McLaren went for a much more wet heavy setup. I'm not sure what the Williams did, but it's possible that the setup was also compromised that way as well. Number 6, moving up 2 positions, probably one of the stars of the weekend was Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, out-qualified Lando Norris in both the main race and the sprint race. Of course, Norris had damage for the qualifying that he did pick up with his mistake. And then in the sprint race, finished second, took the lead briefly for a while, but still really, really excellent result for Piastri in the sprint race. Main race wasn't so good. Of course, retiring on effectively lap 2 with that damage from the collision with Sainz. And like I said before, I did put a bit more blame on Sainz for that. I think that being said, going that sharp into turn 1 is always a recipe for disaster. I remember Verstappen in 2019 did something very similar, and he got damage after making contact with Kimi Räikkönen there as well. So it's just, but that's something that Piastri will learn from, and of course, hopefully over the coming races, he'll continue to build on his excellent performances that he's had the last couple of months. Number 5, dropping 1 position. I might actually have to stand up for this one. Number 5, Fernando Alonso. So for Alonso, in the sprint, really uncharacteristic mistake, crashing out of the sprint race. And then in the main race was okay, finishing in 5th place, which I think is a bit better than they expected. But of course, he was helped by Sainz and Piastri retiring, and I think he would have finished behind them if they had not had that contact. That being said, still a good result for Alonso in the race, but yeah, the sprint race, really, really uncharacteristic mistake there for him. Number 4, moving up 2 positions, is Charles Leclerc. So of course Leclerc finishing second in qualifying for the main Grand Prix, starts on pole with Verstappen's penalty. Really good result. I think he really did the best he could, held off Hamilton behind him, and was within touching distance, I would say, of Perez. He was always about 4 to 6 seconds behind Perez, which given the pace differential between the Ferrari and the Red Bull is honestly pretty good. I think he really got the most out of the main race and the main qualifying. Sprint wasn't so good, but still main race and main qualifying give you the majority of the points, and he really maximized his result there. Number 3, staying in the same position. So I think it was a bit tricky because the drivers I have at number 2 and number 3, and last race number 4 as well with Alonso. I don't think they all had great weekends. I think they were good, but not amazing. So as a result, they've all kind of stayed there because none of the drivers down here, with the exception of Leclerc, I think were worth moving up. And that, of course, is Lewis Hamilton, number 3. Sprint race, of course, got that penalty. You can debate whether or not that should have been a penalty or not, but still was a bit of a clumsy error from Hamilton, and it's very similar to a lot of the other incidents that he's had last 2 to 3 years where he's collided with a Red Bull, just kind of putting a car in a place that there's not really a lot of space, where he has to be inch perfect and just kind of understeering into the car on the outside. So, a bit of a clumsy move there by Hamilton, got himself a penalty, demoted to 7th. Main Grand Prix, though, was very good, finished 4th, and I think maybe you could argue that he should have had a go at Leclerc, but that being said, was much better than his teammate, George Russell. So I've decided to keep him in number 3. Number 2, staying in the same position, is Lando Norris. So for Norris, qualifying as a whole was not so good. Sprint qualifying was a little bit better. or sprint race was a little bit better. Sprint qualifying was a little better than for the main Grand Prix. But that being said, was out-qualified by Oscar Piastri in both sessions, which is not great. The main race, I think, though, he was excellent, though. He had an absolutely horrible first stint, and I don't know if it was a car, I don't know if it was him or what was going on there. Went on the hard tires, looked okay, and then made that really ambitious call to go to the soft tires when it started raining, and he basically shot up the order, and that really, all that speed and momentum took him to a 7th place, basically. And I really don't think that that car had any place being in, any right being that high in the dry conditions. So really, really excellent result by Norris. And I think he did the best he could on the main Grand Prix. Of course, last, staying in the same position for I don't know how many weeks now, is of course Max Verstappen. So for Max Verstappen, sprint race started on pole. Of course, had that tire. Of course, the strategy call with the tire was interesting, and I really want to talk about this for a little bit, but. Hungary 2021, Hamilton's the only driver to take the start, and he basically does a full lap on, I believe, intermediate tires, comes in, everyone else is on dry tires, and he comes out in last. Similar situation happens here with wet tires, and then wet tires, and everyone basically pits for intermediate tires. And I think the reason why Verstappen was able to come out second was that the delta between the wets and the intermediates was a lot smaller than it was between the inners and dries in Hungary 21, which is why Verstappen was able to come out in second. And then, after that, waited for an opportunity, and overtook Piastri very cleanly, very easily, and kind of never looked back. Main Grand Prix, similar story, started 6th with the grid penalty, got a little bit stuck in the DRS train behind Hamilton and Leclerc, but overtook them easily, overtook Perez after the first pit stops, and then went on to cruise to a pretty dominant victory. So for him, another win in his winning streak, extending it to 8, and of course we'll be looking to see if he can extend it to tie the all-time record at his home Grand Prix next time out after the summer break in Zandvoort. So that's all for my power rankings. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.